MTDCNC, bringing you the latest engineering news via video media.
It's been a really interesting exercise, very educational for me, Will, as well. But let's kick off with the leave. What are your thoughts on what you heard from Alan and the parties that said they would look to leave, although there wasn't that many, and it has to be said, the reason for that is a lot of engineers that were, I'd say the split was 50-50, that were up for leaving, didn't actually want to go on camera. So again, be interesting to maybe see why you think that is too. But give us your overview on the leave side.
Well, on that point about the going on camera, I've noticed on LinkedIn, sort of independently, that there are a lot of people come onto the Manufacturing UK LinkedIn group who are quite keen to leave the EU. I called one or two of them, of course I won't mention names, and they weren't keen to appear on the film. It seems to be something that until recent weeks the Leave campaign has had a bit of problem with, and that's getting the business community to express in business terms why it's good to leave. And I suppose it feeds into that sense from the British public that better the devil you know, even though there's a sort of underlying gripe that we're spending too much money on EU membership.
And that's a key point, because Alan mentioned the 10 billion net savings, which is a very controversial figure, which we're hearing a lot about. What do you think about that?
It's a lot of money. I mean, I think one thing is that both campaigns would contest that figure. The figure that on the battle bus for Vote Leave is £350 million a week. Of course, if you take into account the rebate and I think other charitable donations and other bits and pieces, it does reduce considerably. And the Remain campaign would claim it's more like 120 a week, which is a huge difference. But on the face, £10 billion is a lot of money. I think there's a really interesting and difficult to prove argument that some of that money, if Britain left the European Union, could be siphoned or put into manufacturing investment. Things like reinstituting MAS, the Manufacturing Advisory Service, funding more apprenticeships, bankrolling more investments in the HVM catapult, other catapults, and the innovation agenda. The issue is, would it actually happen? Because I think there'd be a huge amount of pressure to do NHS and other public services as well.
On that point, talking to Tom from Subcon Laser, he has recently recruited, as he said on camera, individuals from the EU, and he's done that because he hasn't been able to find those skills here in the UK. So there's one thinking, well, hang on, if we left, he's not going to be able to do that. But you could also counter-argue that if we left and we saved that money, whatever the figure may be, we could invest in the youth, more apprenticeships, as you've said. So it is a difficult one.
I would love it I personally, who knows what I feel, and that's not important, but let's imagine the UK left the EU. It would be great if some of the money we save could be put into manufacturing engineering apprenticeships. That would be a really sensible, value-add, meaningful thing to do with the cash. But the problem is, I think a lot of the companies that need skilled people now can't wait for that lag time for people to be trained. I mean, who's going to wait 5 years for a time-served apprentice to be trained? So it doesn't really solve the problem by training your own in the short term, and that's the period that we're talking about.
Is it long term or is it short term? This is the question as well, because also a couple of the things that Alan mentioned was about the fact that 95% of businesses do not actually trade with the EU, but 100% have to conform to the regulation.
Yeah.
Is that right?
No. 95% of businesses do not trade with the EU, but we all have to comply with the regs. That's tough. On the regulation aspect, it was a point that came up time and time again, and I think it's important that perhaps we discuss the difference between trade regulation, the ease with which a company can do business and transact with European countries, and regulation per se. Because I think in the whole debate, in the panels on television, it's been very badly expressed this amount of bureaucracy from Brussels when it comes to general business regulation, how much worse it would really be than having the regulation from Westminster. An example that Alan Halsall raised was health and safety. Health and safety EU regulation has really punished his company Silver Cross that make high quality prams. But let's be honest, if you're making a very fine tolerance aerospace or nuclear component for a global market, a global industry, the tolerances, the accuracy, the accreditation, and the health and safety, all those regs would be you would be compliant with those regardless of whether we're in the EU or out. It's a global industry. So there's regulation, but I can see how for a footloose, a nimble business like Silver Cross doesn't want to get sort of hampered by this H&S regulation.
But on the regulation point as well, he mentioned about agency staff having similar rights after 3 months. Having similar rights as a full-time skilled worker, for example. Now, again, is that right? Does that not shackle a small business into thinking, well, hang on a minute, can I take the risk of taking on agency staff? A possibility that it's going to put a noose around my neck in 6 months' time. You can kind of see that argument as well.
Yeah, you can. That's tough. Again, I think it's in the devil's in the detail. If I was a small business employer, and I guess I am, but I don't employ agency workers, after 3 months, will I want to give them full-time rights? That sounds punitive. And it's not, as Alan said, it's not very pro-entrepreneurialism. It's the kind of thing that detractors of the EU say comes from the bureaucrats and the oligarchs in Brussels, and it's being laid down upon small, innovative, entrepreneurial businesses. Having said that, if you are one of those workers and you want a job and you want security, that sort of regulation is in your favour. So there's a bit of give and take.
But you could counter-argue that and say, well, if you that job may not be available to you on a short-term contract because the employer won't take the risk of growing his business to take more people on because he doesn't want to be shackled by that regulation. So you might not get that opportunity at all if you're looking for a position.
Yeah, no, I think on that agency workers directives, it is a tough one. But one thing that is worth pointing out, and I think Jürgen Meyer did it in his piece, is that some of the employment legislation that we're abiding by at the moment in business or about to actually comes from the UK, and it's not an EU directive. And one of them that's hitting companies all over the place is the national minimum wage. Now, whether or not you approve of it, and many people do, businesses still have to conform, but we created it. So not all bad news comes from Brussels.
So in summary, on the leave side, the focus is from a lot of the people we've spoken to, it is about the money, it is about the regulation, it is about having a small business maybe potentially looking to grow it. But I think more interestingly as well, it's about the fact that in a lot of instances they haven't been prepared to voice that on camera. But Alan was certainly very, very vocal in that respect.
And finally, on leave, I think he was so vocal on free trade agreements between all countries. Yeah. What a lovely nirvana that would be. The fact is that, we don't have these FTAs between all the trading countries the UK trades with. And part of the reason is because we're in the EU, of course. But if we left, first of all, how long would it take to negotiate those free trade agreements? Leave campaign would say, well, don't worry about the length of time. It's going to be good for the long run. But we've seen, I think, evidence that Canada has a free trade agreement with Britain that's taken something like 8 years to negotiate. So if you're in business, it is this problem that you've got to work out how long it's going to take to work out an FTA with another country. And sometimes it's better to stay where you are.
This would bring me on to the in, because when we look at the Remainers, certainly from the manufacturers, we'll come on to Jürgen shortly, but from the manufacturing perspective, there is a lot of better the devil you know. There's that comfort factor. There's the fact that we've been in the EU, business is okay. We're doing all right at the moment. Do we want to put that at risk? Is that a good enough reason to remain?
I think it really depends on the industry you're in, because I touched on earlier the difference between manufacturing sort of textiles or luxury goods like prams versus the aerospace industry, which is global. Yes, I think it really depends on what you do. We're at Subcon, and a lot of the companies at Subcon in the subcontract SME space are making manufacturing parts for large assemblies that are made by and sold by global OEMs. If you make a component for a Siemens or GE is an American company, but a Bosch or perhaps a Vinci in France or Alstom, if you left the EU or remained in, you have to make the part to the specifications that company gives to you to be in its supply chain. Now, if those specifications are partly mandated, partly affected by that country's membership of the EU, then it sort of makes sense that Britain is in the EU, because then your paperwork will comply naturally to your OEM customer. But you could argue that, look, if we're out of the EU, we're not going to spend as much money, and I can do the paperwork for Siemens or for Bosch very happily myself. It just sort of sounds intuitive that it's going to be easier if you're in.
It could become more complicated.
Yeah.
There's no guaranteed outcome. And if you look at some of our clients and our customers from a machine tool distribution perspective or from a tooling distribution perspective, if they're importing products from Europe, things are going to change, potentially, and that could impact on their business. It could make it more. It could potentially increase lead times. It could mean that costs change. So that could impact on their business. So you can see a very strong argument for that type of client of ours to favour the Remain. But there is this big argument. It's the big company versus the small company.
That's right.
Is it about big business remaining?
I think if you were to assess Alan Halsel's pitch, it did seem to come down to big versus small. There are bureaucrats and lobbyists. I think he said something like 30,000 people are employed in the lobbying profession in Brussels, which sounds extraordinary. The implication is that those people are employed to get to generate and get the EU to comply with the will of big business. Trouble is all that lobbying and regulation really that bad? I mean, some of this has the environment at its heart. There's some good reasons to be bureaucratic in the sense that the companies are not just doing it to make profits. The regulation has been created so that we have a level playing field and we're doing right things by the protocols, Paris and Kyoto, to keep carbon emissions down. But yeah, he was pitching it very much as a big versus small. And I suppose it does seem to be, there's an air of sense there, of truth there, isn't it? That as a small company, you might be freer and less shackled if you left one of these supranational blocks like the EU.
And when you hear Jürgen's interview that you did, he is very much about big business. It is about a community of companies. It's about a community of countries working together to produce and innovate. And that was very apparent to listening to Jürgen. And in fact, access to the single market makes it easier to do business, which for big business, that's great. Let's touch on the monetary point, because there is also an interesting statistic. We talk about the 10 billion net savings if we left the EU. Again, controversial figure, but it has been used. There is a slant to this where some of that money can be or is being invested into R&D programs, which is what Jürgen was talking about, which are developing new innovations and new products, which at the moment we are involved in.
Yeah.
If we leave, we're not.
Yeah, there's two points to the money within the EU on the Remain camp, I think, that are really important. As you say, Paul, very importantly, globally, there are some really big engineering science projects coming through in the next 20 years that are going to transform the way we do things. Things like driverless cars, things like Industry 4.0, the digital factory and smart cities. Now, if you're involved in those programs as a member of a bloc, yes, you could argue the toss either way, but generally, you're going to be better off combining the brain power and the money of 28 member nations or 50 states, as in the case of the US, collective brain power and money to advance those programs more quickly.